So this morning's program is really about addressing the problems in traditional science. And for that, our next talk is a fireside chat between Logan and Michael Harte. So Logan is Molecules Biotech Operations Manager. She has lab experience, she has operational experience, she's a general sort of Swiss Army knife of tricks. And then Michael Harte is a VC who got in pretty early with Beaker DAO, one of the investments DAOs in DeSci, and is now looking to start his own T1 DAO, type 1 diabetes DAO. So welcome to the stage, Michael and Logan.
Come, Michael. Come. Which side's your good side?
Here we go.
Thanks so much, Ella, for the nice, warm welcome. This is my second DeSci Berlin. I'm very happy to be back. And today I'm joined by the lovely Michael Harte. And I know the topic of our panel, Fireside Chat today is kind of, what DeSci can learn from TradFi. So I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes picking his brain, getting as many insights as possible. So yeah, of course, welcome, Michael.
Yeah,
and I would love to learn a little bit more about you because you have a very interesting background. You worked for many years at a hedge fund. So I think a lot of us are used to hearing the term, venture capital here, but maybe we haven't met so many hedge fund managers here. So would love to hear how you got into, kind of like the world of finance and how you stumbled across DeSci and how you ended up on this lovely couch here today.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for the intro. Good to see a lot of familiar faces here. I guess my finance career goes back about 20 some years. My first job out of uni, I was at a corporate finance role in Tallinn, Estonia, actually at a boutique investment bank. Then went back to the States for grad school. And during that period, I met Peter Thiel, and he had sold PayPal recently and had started a hedge fund, actually. And for those who aren't familiar, a hedge fund is they're a private pool of capital, limited to the number of investors, and they can go short and long, and they tend to deal in liquid instruments, unlike venture capital, which is long time horizons and deeply illiquid. So I ended up working for Peter for about half a decade at Clarium Capital. And it was a pretty formative experience. It was when a lot of, things that have become well-known now were taking off. I guess a lot of it, we didn't know at the time, but a lot of it's become, a lot of it's become pretty well-known at this point. And then, of course, he's probably more famous for the venture capital side, but he did have a hedge fund. It was a global macro hedge fund, and I traded currencies and commodities, a lot of oil trading, and so that was my formative experience. And then eventually got away from the sort of hedge fund game and went into more to venture capital. And my original intro was through the longevity community, which I'd been involved with for a while. And it's been a frustrating place to invest in. Nothing's quite worked in the longevity space. Hopefully Vita DAO changes that. But, and then got into public biotech investing, which has been in a brutal bear market since 2021. And, I think it's an interesting thing to consider because when we're looking at a lot of the bio DAOs and things coming out of DeSci, there's a lot of competition right now from the public biotech space because valuations are incredibly cheap. So I think it's always worth asking in the DeSci context what's going to drive the marginal dollar to some of the tokens and investments that we're discussing here in the next 2 days. And it's definitely an experiment worth running, but I think everyone needs to think about the value proposition pretty carefully. So that's a little bit about my background. We can get into. Sorry.
I like fluid at you.
Really close. Okay. And I guess my DeSci journey began about 2 years ago at Zuzalu, in Montenegro, with Vitalik Buterin. Those who aren't familiar, organized a 2-month pop-up city, if you want to call it that. And I met Paul there, and James Brody, who runs BeakerDAO, and a crypto hedge fund, ID Theory, and is just a wonderful human being, and sort of pushed me in the DeSci direction, which is a bit of a departure for someone who's been around in the investment landscape for a while. But again, I think it's an experiment worth running. There's still a lot about the model that needs to be proven, but I think everyone's doing good work here, and if it's going to work, we're going to figure it out here.
Absolutely. I feel like everybody, you kind of mentioned this is an experiment, worth running. I really love the energy and kind of the attitude so far of the people in the ecosystem kind of having that mentality as well, that they're willing to just try something, iterate, learn from experience, start your version 2 and pick up where you left off. And you mentioned also, so you had experience working at a hedge fund, also at a VC, public biotech markets, and you mentioned, thinking about things from the demand side, which also ties into some of the things that Paul mentioned in his opening talk, right? Like the marginal dollar. If I have $1, where am I going to put it? What is the most compelling use case and story for this? So yeah, curious kind of from your experience in hedge funds, VC, and public biotech markets, if you have that $1, what are some of the maybe compelling narratives in DeSci, like taking these perspectives into account, and where is there room for improvement when you're looking at it through your traditional investor lens, that you're like, these are the types of things I would normally look at, and these are, this information is missing for me in DeSci to be willing to put in that dollar?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Again, like I said earlier, there's a lot of competition right now from the public biotech. I know Paul, where's Paul? He would disagree with me on this. He thinks the public biotech game is over, which it could be, but the capital raising demands are just enormous when you're doing anything in sort of traditional biotech, where you have to get through all the trials and all the compliance, and hopefully DeSci is a way to circumvent that. So I think there's a lot that could be done on sort of the cost structure and overhead that would make DeSci a compelling investment, removing just a lot of unnecessary expense. And I think there's always this problem in public biotech as well with principal agents. A lot of trials are going nowhere in a lot of public biotech companies, but they have enormous cash raised in better times, and they're not particularly interested in shutting down because a lot of the people involved are, making very decent salaries, and their interest is to keep using investor cash. And I think DeSci might be able to sort of circumvent some of that problem and fail faster, and not have these, principal agent problems to the same degree they exist in public biotech. So that would be a case for why structurally DeSci might make sense. And then just the enthusiasm and the global community. I think that's still something that needs to be proven out, like the community aspect. If you think about the compelling narratives in the DeSci ecosystem, I think it's the capital raising value proposition is pretty significant, and I think they've been pretty decent. Not huge amounts of capital today, but pretty decent at raising and deploying capital. So I think the funding mechanism is reasonably well established. I think the community mechanism and the sort of citizen scientist and having a global community that can contribute to this stuff, I think that's still something that needs to be proven out. That would be very valuable to the thesis if it is proven out. But again, experiment worth running. But I think that's still something that's in the works.
Yeah, and you mentioned the kind of principal agent problem that we see in kind of traditional biotech companies. So just like on paper, looking at some of the math of these things, right? Like most early stage research is going to fail. And the problem actually arises when something that should fail is not allowed to fail. So you can imagine, you find an interesting result in the lab, you spin out a company based on this result, you hire your team, your CEO, your CSO, your operating team. You get maybe like 1 to 2 years of runway to run your experiments to decide whether or not you want to continue. You reach the end of those 2 years, you don't necessarily have data that supports continuing the project, but how motivated is the team actually to close the company and kind of hang up their hats and say, yeah, we took this as far as we could, but this is not a viable hypothesis anymore. This is not going to work. Nobody's going to just willingly give up their job and say, no, please, like, fire me, kill my only project that I'm working on.
Maybe you.
Sometimes you
knowledge here at your past position. I think you were willing to do that, but it's a very rare thing for people to sort of voluntarily want to shut down their own job and return cash to investors or what have you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I had one experience that Michael knows in a former company. We didn't necessarily have data that supported continuing, and the team and I were actually quite proactive in giving this position to our investors and saying, like, look, if we're not going to find another way around it, then it's not worth pursuing. And it may be kind of like a rare outcome, but it was more out of like frustration of wasted resources that I would much rather figure out another way forward than continuing to kind of bang your head with the same problem over time. And what's interesting about, DeSci, if we think about the incentive structure, like we love a Charlie Munger quote over here, right? Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. So we talk a lot about incentives in DeSci and kind of using tokens as a tool for incentives. But sometimes I find that the conversation around this like ends at the conversation around tokens, right? It's like, oh, we're just going to have tokens and we'll just give them to people as incentives, right? But if we think about this mechanism, right? Like, how can you incentivize people to only progress the things that need progressing and to be willing actually to speak up about the things that should not progress so that you can save your resources and allocate them better in the future? That for me is super interesting to try to figure out. And I think a lot of the DAOs, have the tools and capabilities to design in this space around it and try as much as possible to be even more capital and resource efficient. And I kind of want to shift gears a little bit in terms of addressing some of your community comments as well about the people in the DAOs. Here at Molecule this past year, we ran an inaugural course, so we called it DeSci EDU. We have a few participants here today, which is of course very nice. Because we were noticing that, there's so many different topics overlapping here. I'm sitting here talking to somebody with like hedge fund manager experience. I have a scientific background. You have people from marketing, design, Web3. There's so many different intersections of kind of skill sets here that it's hard as one person to figure out how you fit into the grand scheme of things and like what's really the big problem and how do we tackle it in an interdisciplinary way. So we put together an 8-week course and had students from all different backgrounds learning about what it takes to bring DeSci to life. And there are a few other initiatives as well. So Barrett and Aaron from Muse Matrix also ran a fellowship program this year. So I think everybody's kind of figuring out that there's a little bit of a gap maybe in skills and education for people in the space. So curious, to hear your thoughts, given that you're starting a new DAO together with one of our DeSci EDU students here. How are you also thinking about talent development in the space, and how can we maybe improve upon this?
Yeah, I think there are a couple issues there. One is the Web3 knowledge, right? And the other is just the sort of general biotech knowledge. And you need both to really be functioning well here. And I think when you look at the model of the DAOs, there's an interesting paradox between like centralization versus decentralization, right? I mean, decentralization is of course all the vogue in this community, but I don't think these things work unless there's a strong core team really driving and managing and executing really well. And there are certain functions that just can't be decentralized. And there's this notion that everything will sort of bubble up from the bottom via the incentive structure, but I'm not sure that actually works, right? In the startup context, having a strong founder with like ego involved is usually a sign of, future success. I think there's probably something like that will work in the BioDAO context as well. But I think Barrett and Aaron's initiative and DeSci EDU has been very valuable on the Web3 side, trying to get people more literate in what everyone is doing here and building. Then there's a background question of just like, how do you get very talented scientists involved? Because that's going to be what really makes or breaks a lot of this. And I think it's an open question what sort of is going to incentivize a lot of top people to do it. I'm very encouraged. We have Ed Boyden on later, someone I've met with before, a very talented individual. Incredible that he's taking an interest. Obviously, Bob Langer, also at MIT. Getting people involved like that would really increase the credibility. But behind that, you're going to need a lot more education and literacy on the Web3 side. And I really appreciate the work that you've done. And Ella, or shout out Ella, and I don't know if Barrett and Aaron are here, but they've done an incredible job. And I think we've also thought about doing something like a DeSci focused pop-up for a few weeks. Barrett and Aaron already did one in Castalia in Mexico City, but something along those lines could be compelling going forward. The network state idea is something I've also been fairly involved with in the past couple of years. And, I think that idea has legs, and that could be useful in the context of educating people on DeSci.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. I think our time is up, so I'm going to wrap it up here. But if any people here today have any questions, comments, want to come chat to either Michael or I about, education in DeSci or incentives or, any of the topics here today, then you know where to find us. But thank you so much for joining me here, Michael.